A few years before World War I, Alfred Harmsworth, the owner of the British newspaper The Daily Mail and the future Lord Northcliffe, traveled around German industrial cities, which at that time were experiencing rapid industrialization. And he returned from there with a troubling premonition. Each of these factory chimneys is a cannon aimed at England, he wrote in a letter to one of his employees. And in many cases, a very powerful cannon. At the beginning of the 20th century, Britain felt for the first time that a competitor's industrial base was not just an economy, but military power delayed in time. Many Americans who visit Chinese cities today experience a similar feeling. But now, America finds itself in a different kind of race with a different rival, China. Where just 2 decades ago, there was mainly the world's factory, now there is a combination of manufacturing scale, engineering speed, and technological self-confidence. China is already on par with the United States of America, or even pulling ahead in a number of technologies, especially at the cutting edge of artificial intelligence, wrote former Google CEO Eric Schmidt and his colleague Selena Xu after their trips to China. According to the updated SPI Critical Technology Tracker, for 2026, China is already leading in 69 out of 74 tracked critical technologies. From advanced manufacturing and drones to specific areas of artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and energy technologies. In industry, China accounts for about 30% of the world's manufacturing value added and has remained the largest manufacturing nation in the world for more than a decade and a half. China's dominance in manufacturing and its technological capabilities, combined with Beijing's rapidly growing economic arsenal, pose a serious strategic challenge for Washington. This is on a completely different scale than ordinary trade competition. In the first part of the video about economic wars, we already showed how the United States of America learned to use key nodes of the global economy: the dollar, the financial system, technology, sanctions, and export controls as tools of geopolitical pressure. We clarified the difference between symbolic sanctions, the policy of attrition, and coercion. And we came to the conclusion that the problem with American economic power is that the more often Washington weaponizes its advantages, the more actively other countries look for ways to break away from them. In this video, we will show how China is building its own powerful sources of leverage and responding more and more harshly to American pressure. The United States will not give in or lose its global leadership. The world is entering a new era where the struggle is no longer just for markets or resources, but for the rules of the future economic order. Its main question now is not only who has stronger levers, but who is ready to withstand the cost of using them. In April 2025, Kitai imposed strict controls on the export of rare earth elements in response to Trump's devastating tariffs. The Ministry of Commerce of the People's Republic of Kitai imposed export licenses on 7 of 17 rare earth elements: samarium, gadolinium, terbium, dysprosium, lutetium, scandium, and yttrium, as well as related magnets, alloys, and compounds. These materials are critically important for cars, wind turbines, electronics, radars, aviation, and high-precision weapons. Ford has temporarily halted production at its plant in the Chicago area, where the Explorer SUV is assembled, due to a shortage of components. One of the world's largest defense corporations, Raytheon, tried to find alternative supplies of a mineral that must withstand extreme temperatures, especially in high-precision missiles like the Tomahawk. The Trump administration is rushing to the negotiating table and has agreed to ease some of the tariff pressure in exchange for the resumption of rare earth materials and magnet supplies. A few months later, the United States Department of Commerce tightened its own export control regulations. On September 29, 2025, the Bureau of Industry and Security introduced the Affiliates Rule, also known as the 50% Rule. The essence of this rule is that if a foreign company is at least 50% directly or indirectly affiliated with a company already on the restricted lists, then all export restrictions automatically apply to it as well. Beijing responded even more harshly. On October 9, 2025, the People's Republic of China announced its own export control package, which was already extraterritorial in nature. Foreign companies had to obtain a Chinese license even to sell products manufactured outside the People's Republic of China if they contained Chinese rare earth materials or were produced using Chinese technologies. In some categories, the threshold was only 0.1% of the final product's value. This was a mirrored response to the American logic of the de minimis and foreign direct product rule. Only now did Washington realize that similar rules could be applied by Beijing as well. As a result, the United States backed down. On November 10, 2025, the Bureau of Industry and Security of the United States suspended the affiliates rule for 1 year, and China, in turn, agreed to a 1-year pause on new rare earth restrictions. Clearly reflecting the shift in power dynamics, Trump began referring to the United States and China as the G2, the Big Two. Before his meeting with Xi Jinping in Busan on October 30, 2025, he wrote on Truth Social, "The G2 will soon convene," and the formula, which for the allies of the United States sounded almost like an acknowledgement of a new bipolarity. The rare earth metals crisis revealed the main point. In protecting the economic security of the United States, priorities are more important than slogans. Instead of a scattered policy aimed at relocating production across a wide range of industries, Washington needs to clearly identify the areas where China truly has leverage over the United States and its allies, and work collectively to reduce these dependencies. In addition to rare earth elements, this list includes significant bottlenecks in the supply chains of pharmaceutical products and clean energy technologies. When Beijing imposed sanctions on Skydio, the largest American drone manufacturer, in October 2024, the company was forced to ration batteries. Only 1 battery per drone. In the electric vehicle sector, the scale is even larger. According to the International Energy Agency, in 2024, more than 11 million electric vehicles were sold in China, nearly 2/3 of global sales. China produced over 70% of all electric vehicles in the world. BYD Auto, meanwhile, has already surpassed Tesla in the broader new energy vehicle segment. Vehicles powered by new energy sources, and according to market estimates, by the end of 2025, it will have surpassed Tesla in sales of pure battery electric vehicles as well. BYD Auto sold about 9.25 million, compared to approximately 1.64 million for Tesla. The Trump administration often downplayed the significance of this shift, emphasizing the abundance of American fossil resources. And indeed, the United States of America remains an energy giant. In 2024, they produced a record of over 103 quadrillion British thermal units of energy. They were the world's largest producer of crude oil, with a record 13.2 million barrels per day, and nearly 1.08 million cubic meters in dry natural gas production. That's about 26% of the world's annual natural gas production. America may be able to get by without a strong domestic industry or clean energy, but the rest of the world is rapidly electrifying, and the shock in oil markets caused by Iran's disruption of shipping in the Strait of Hormuz only reinforces this trend. As we mentioned in the first video, about 20 million barrels of oil and petroleum products per day passed through the Strait of Hormuz in 2025. That is, about a quarter of the world's maritime oil trade, as well as nearly a fifth of global liquefied gas trade, particularly from Qatar and the Emirates. When the price of oil spikes due to military or logistical risks, electric vehicles, batteries, solar panels, and grid equipment stop being a green trend and become infrastructure for energy survival. If Washington gives the global clean tech market to Beijing, it will grant China enormous economic leverage over everyone else, including Europe, India, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The United States doesn't need to fully replace Chinese products, as doing so would be too costly, labor-intensive, and unnecessary. Instead, policymakers should aim to create parallel sources of supply that can be quickly ramped up in a crisis, just as China is trying to build a parallel financial infrastructure in case of a dollar blockade. In the case of rare earth metals, this does not necessarily mean creating an anti-China bloc, but rather diversifying supply just enough to break Beijing's monopoly power to shut off the tap. Economic security doesn't always require complete self-sufficiency. Often, it is enough to reduce dependence from critical to manageable, as in the case of magnets, batteries, or pharmaceutical ingredients. Even 15 to 25% of alternative capacity that can be quickly scaled up can change the behavior of a monopolist or deprive them of the confidence that blackmail will work. And this is where a potential star moment opens up for Ukraine. The trade war between the US and China has shown that the West cannot build electric vehicles batteries, and energy storage systems when the critical material for anodes is effectively controlled by China. In 2025, it provided about 82% of the world's natural graphite production and over 90% of anode capacity. Even in 2035, according to forecasts by the International Energy Agency, China may retain about 80% of battery graphite. But the problem is not just the ore. The West needs not just graphite deposits, but also purification, spheronization, coating, graphitization, and qualified AM for battery manufacturers. And here, Ukraine can become part of a new secure supply architecture for the European Union and the United States of America. We have a resource base, proximity to Europe, and the strategic interest of allies in reducing dependence on China. But to enter this game, Ukraine needs to sell not raw materials, but finished or almost finished anode material. With such a development, coordination with allies is not just desirable, but indispensable. Economic studies show that when countries try to reduce vulnerabilities individually, they risk triggering a doom loop of fragmentation. Every exit from a large common market reduces the value of that market for those who remain, and thus encourages others to leave as well. As a result, everyone gets less benefit from integration, even though each country acted individually out of security concerns. The American shift to Buy American is an example of this. Under the Biden and Trump administrations, this shows how contagious unilateral efforts to strengthen economic security can be. In February 2026, the leaders of the European Union advanced their own Buy European approaches for strategic sectors, defense, artificial intelligence, clean tech, and other areas, directly acknowledging that Europe does not want to become dependent on either China or the United States of America. But without coordination, allies may unknowingly slide into quasi-autarky, where everyone builds their own duplicated, expensive, and less efficient industrial framework, and together, they all become poorer, slower, and less resilient. The critical minerals trade zone proposed by the Trump administration looks like a promising path. In February 2026, Vice President J.D. Vance, at the Critical Minerals Ministerial Meeting, attended by representatives from over 50 countries, proposed creating a preferential trade zone for critical minerals with applicable price floors. That is, reference prices that would protect producers from allied countries against dumping and price manipulation. According to this initiative, the European Union, Japan, and other allies of the United States will set minimum prices, coordinate financing for mining and processing projects, and also agree to supply minerals to each other on stable terms outside of Chinese influence. If successful, this could become a model not only for rare earth metals, but also for other strategic sectors: batteries, pharmaceuticals, semiconductor materials, solar components, and defense supply chains. However, reducing dependence is only half of the equation. The other half is the opponent's response. If the United States of America and its allies build alternative sources of supply, China may respond with new export restrictions, sanctions against individual companies, regulatory delays, or technological blockades. The strategic goal is not to produce everything at home, but to ensure that no opponent can stop a factory, an army, a hospital, or the energy transition with a single decision. In April 2025, economist and president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, Adam Posen, argued in Foreign Affairs that China has escalation dominance over the United States in an economic war. That is, no matter what tool Washington uses, Beijing is supposedly always able to hit back harder. Posen argued that the tariff war hits the United States especially hard precisely because America depends on Chinese goods that are difficult or impossible to quickly replace. From cheap electronics and pharmaceutical components to critical minerals. Given China's chokehold on critical goods, the United States should seek to ease tensions with China at least until it reduces its dependence on these supplies. The logic of his argument that the United States has no immediate answer to China's rare earth weapon has since become accepted wisdom in Washington. Some officials from Trump's team even referred to the formula traditionally attributed to Deng Xiaoping, the former chairman of China's Central Military Commission. Hide your strength and bide your time. They used this to explain why the US should avoid direct confrontation with Beijing until the American industrial base becomes less vulnerable. although researchers of Chinese diplomacy argue about whether he actually used those exact words. In any case, it has become a symbol of China's strategy of building up strength without premature confrontation. However, this perspective underestimates America's leverage. The most powerful choke points, which we examined in detail in the first part of the video about economic wars under Washington's control, include the dollar, advanced semiconductors, technology, chip design software, and jet engines. They are much harder to bypass than China's dominance in rare earth processing. At the same time, China's advantage is not technologically insurmountable. Resources and potential projects exist in Australia, Brazil, Vietnam, the US, Malaysia, and Europe, especially in Ukraine. And new processing technologies like recycling and rare mining can reduce dependence on a single supplier. Instead, the dollar system remains deeper and more inertial. The same applies to semiconductors. In October 2022, the Bureau of Industry and Security of the U.S. Department of Commerce introduced export controls and restrictions aimed at limiting the People's Republic of China's ability to purchase advanced AI chips, support supercomputers, and produce advanced semiconductors. These regulations affected not only finished chips, but also manufacturing equipment and foreign goods with American technological components. Such restrictions are more painful than a simple ban on raw materials, because China can find other mines or invest in processing, but it can't quickly reproduce the entire stack. And it's not just about chips, but about the entire chain. GPU architectures, chip design software, lithography equipment, special chemicals, modern chip packaging, as well as the experience of engineers and the manufacturing culture of companies like TSMC, Samsung, ASML, and NVIDIA. It's a similar situation in aviation. The Chinese passenger plane C919 is often called the Chinese Boeing, but it still depends on Western technologies. In particular, the plane uses the LEAP-1C engine. It was created by a joint venture between the American giant General Electric and the French multinational corporation Safran, and the Chinese CJ1000A is still in the process of development and certification. If the United States can maintain its leadership in artificial intelligence, the models produced by Silicon Valley firms could become the foundation of global business, giving Washington yet another choke point of extraordinary influence. The Stanford AI Index 2025 shows that in 2024, the United States created 40 of the most well-known artificial intelligence models. China created 15, while Europe as a whole only 3. At the same time, China is rapidly closing the quality gap, and in terms of publications and patents, it is already ahead in many respects. According to Epoch AI's assessment from January 2026, all models from 2023 that were at the forefront of AI capabilities were developed in the United States, and Chinese models, on average, lagged behind by about 7 months. The gap ranged from 4 to 14 months. So, to accept in advance the futility of waging all forms of economic warfare would mean giving Beijing an effective veto over American policy precisely during the period that researcher Rash Doshi calls the decisive decade of US-Chinese rivalry. In his book, The Long Game, he describes the Chinese strategy as a long, consistent attempt to push the United States out of the regional and global order. Washington can regain control over Chinese policy if it builds real deterrence, that is, creates escalation options that are convincing enough to force Beijing to back down. A useful precedent: American export restrictions against ZTE, the Chinese telecommunications giant. In 2018, after the company violated the terms of a previous agreement regarding illegal shipments to Iran and North Korea, the first Trump administration pushed the company to the brink of collapse by cutting off access to American components, including Qualcomm chips, Google software, and other critical electronics. Within a few weeks, ZTE announced that the company's main operations had ceased. This statement became one of the clearest pieces of evidence of American technological leverage. ZTE survived only because Xi Jinping personally raised the issue directly with Trump, who agreed to ease the restrictions. Today, the US has enough leverage to withstand an escalation scenario with China or any other country. Washington's problem is not a complete lack of tools, but the political willingness to endure its own economic losses. After the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, American administrations increasingly saw economic warfare as a substitute for military force, which had become too politically costly. According to estimates by Brown University, the wars following the largest terrorist attack on September 11, 2001, cost the United States about $8 trillion. During this time, at least 4.5 million people died in conflict zones, taking into account both direct and indirect losses. And the costs for veterans and debt servicing will remain a financial burden for the United States for decades to come. But now Washington is losing its appetite, even for economic warfare. The tariffs of Trump's second term followed a familiar pattern. The White House makes a sharp move, markets fall, fears of a recession arise, and the administration backs down or announces a pause. On April 9, 2025, Trump imposed a 90-day pause on most reciprocal tariffs, leaving the tougher rates on China. The stock market surged sharply after that. Specifically, the S&P 500 rose by more than 9%, and the Nasdaq by over 12%. After several days of panic selling, the world learned its lesson. Washington's Achilles heel in economic conflicts is not a lack of weapons, but a low tolerance for pain. Economic war is not just about who can inflict more damage on the other's GDP. It's about which side has a greater ability to withstand it. Washington can increase its endurance by strengthening internal pressure points in advance, which most often provoke a political reaction. For example, concerns about rising oil prices have repeatedly limited sanctions campaigns against Russia and Iran. In March 2026, after the war with Iran blocked the Strait of Hormuz, Brent rose from about $70 to over $120 per barrel. The Trump administration temporarily eased sanctions on Russian oil without demanding any concessions regarding Ukraine, and it also issued a waiver for the sale of about 140 million barrels of Iranian oil that was at sea. This could have brought Russia an additional $3.3 to $5 billion in oil revenues. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated that this waiver would bring about 140 million barrels of oil to the world markets and help reduce pressure on energy supplies. So, in search of cheap gasoline, Washington gave a temporary reprieve to two adversaries, Moscow and Tehran. In fact, by seeking to lower prices, they are actually financing their adversaries during the war. Reducing America's dependence on oil could have prevented gas prices from dictating American strategy during geopolitical crises. According to the International Energy Agency, in 2025, Americans used about 136.7 billion gallons of gasoline. It accounted for about 56% of the energy consumption in the transportation sector, and nearly half of all petroleum product consumption in the United States. In strategic terms, this means that as long as American policy is so dependent on prices, any dictator who can influence the oil market gets an indirect say in U.S. sanctions policy. Another aspect: presidents have to work much harder to build public support when waging economic war. Americans are much more willing to endure economic sacrifices when they believe the cause is just and the strategy is clear. Sometimes presidents lag behind the public. After Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the Biden administration initially acted cautiously regarding Russian oil, fearing a spike in prices, although polls showed different public sentiments. In March 2022, 63% of Americans were willing to pay more for gasoline to support a democratic country, and 80% supported a complete ban on Russian oil and gas. Biden eventually banned the import of Russian oil, liquefied gas, and coal. But the very fact of the initial caution showed that the administration was afraid not only of Moscow, but also of a domestic price shock. The war with Iran, meanwhile, reminded Americans of the cost of military power. Therefore, it may be easier for elected leaders to convince the public that economic war is a better alternative, even if it comes with financial costs. If Washington threatens economic measures to deter a Chinese attack on Taiwan, trust in it will be paramount. Beijing will ask, are the United States ready to withstand the economic consequences of escalation? Not just a temporary market downturn, but months and possibly years of more expensive dollars, supply disruptions, declining corporate profits, and political pressure from voters and allies. Last year gave Chinese leaders reason to doubt. Tariffs were postponed after market downturns. Oil sanctions were eased due to fears over prices. And negotiations over rare earth materials forced Washington to make concessions in related areas. If this perception doesn't change, Beijing may conclude that the American economic arsenal is impressive on paper, but useless in practice. That is, the US will have the most powerful economic weapon in the world, but the opponent will believe that Washington won't dare to pull the trigger. Historically, the post-war economic order was built not spontaneously, but through major international conferences, agreements, and institutions. Bretton Woods, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and later the World Trade Organization. In July 1944, even before the end of World War II, representatives of 44 countries gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to create a framework for post-war monetary and financial stability. The result was the creation of the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the future core of the World Bank Group. In 1947, 23 countries signed the GATT Agreement, which was intended to lower tariffs and prevent a return to the protectionist chaos of the 1930s. The first round of negotiations covered about 45,000 tariff concessions and trade worth approximately $10 billion, which was a very significant amount for the post-war economy. In 1995, based on the Uruguay round, the World Trade Organization was established, which today has 166 members and covers about 98% of world trade. Today, a new architecture is emerging in place of this order, but no longer based on unified agreements. It is being built with sanctions, tariffs, export controls, subsidies, and so on, where each new unilateral intervention adds another brick to the foundation of the future system, without always asking whether it can withstand such a load. In 2023, IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva warned that the global economy could split into rival blocs, rolling back decades of integration. According to IMF estimates, the long-term losses from deeper trade fragmentation could reach up to 7% of global GDP, or approximately $7.4 trillion. This is equivalent to the combined size of the economies of France and Germany. But history shows that blocs themselves are not the worst-case scenarios. Chaotic fragmentation is much more dangerous. It's an every-country-for-itself world, where countries simultaneously raise barriers, copy each other's protectionism, buy up resources, block technologies, and destroy trust in common rules. It was exactly this logic, beggar thy neighbor, make your neighbor a beggar, that tore apart the global economy in the 1930s and led to World War II. After the Smoot-Hawley Tariff in 1930, about 24 countries responded with their own barriers, and international trade between 1929 and 1934 fell by about 65%. Economic historians clarify that the tariff was not the only cause of the Great Depression, but it deepened the downturn, fueled mutual reprisals, and made the crisis more politically divisive. The Cold War was also an era of fragmentation, but not of complete economic breakdown. Trade between opposing blocs did indeed decrease. According to the IMF, the share of trade between competing blocs in global trade fell from 10 to 15% to less than 5% during the Cold War. But within the Western Bloc, between the US, Western Europe, Japan, Canada, Australia, and other allies, economic ties were close and institutionally established, which allowed the United States of America to experience one of the strongest periods of peacetime growth in its history. During the period from 1947 to 1973, the real GDP of the United States grew by an average of 4% per year, and the real GDP per capita by 2.5% per year. So the problem is not that the world may become bloc-based again, but whether these blocs will be large enough, open within, and governed by rules. Economic security and prosperity are not incompatible. They only come into conflict when countries try to guarantee security on their own. If every country starts duplicating supply chains at home and closing markets even to allies, it will lead to expensive and inefficient autarky. Instead, coordinated fragmentation, When the US and its allies build trusted supply chains, agree on sanctions, synchronize export controls and industrial policies, can preserve the scale without which modern economies cannot function, and at the same time neutralize the industrial power of competitors like China and Russia. Just as in the 1990s, the United States promoted a positive vision of globalization, open markets, World Trade Organization rules, capital mobility, integration into global trade. Now they need a similar positive vision for the new economic order. A strong foundation could be an economic security coalition, not a replacement for NATO, but its economic counterpart in critical sectors: critical minerals, batteries, semiconductor materials, clean energy, cloud infrastructure, maritime logistics, and other nodes where China or Russia have real leverage. In 2022, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said that democracies cannot allow countries to use their dominance in critical materials, technologies, or products for geopolitical blackmail, and must deepen integration with those, quote, they can rely on. And this only works when friends truly coordinate, not just mimic each other under mutual protectionism. In critical minerals, such a framework has already begun to emerge. The Mineral Security Partnership, established in 2022, brought together the US, the EU, Japan, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, South Korea, and other partners. And the Mineral Security Partnership Forum, launched in 2024 in Leuven, already includes 30 participants, including Ukraine, India, Kazakhstan, Namibia, Peru, the Philippines, Serbia, Turkey, Uzbekistan, and Zambia. This is exactly the type of institution that can turn risk reduction from a chaotic slogan into a managed architecture. In batteries, China controls 80% of the market, and in certain segments, such as LFP cathode materials or precursor cathode materials, it holds almost monopolistic positions. In pharmaceuticals, dependence is more complex than the common claim that everything comes from China. The main vulnerability of the US in this area is not only in finished, active pharmaceutical ingredients, but deeper, in raw materials, solvents, reagents, and key production components that can be supplied through India or other countries, masking their Chinese origin. A bloc-based global economy can serve the interests of both the US and its partners, but only under two conditions. The bloc must be large enough and cohesive enough. If it is small, it lacks scale. Production becomes expensive, innovation slows down, and companies lose access to markets, capital, and talent. If it is large but politically divided, it turns into a marketplace of mutual exceptions. The US promotes Buy American. The EU promotes Buy European. Japan and Korea protect their own manufacturers, while countries of the global south are left as suppliers of raw materials without a real place in the upper value chains. Therefore, the new economic order cannot simply be a club of wealthy democracies that have agreed to buy from each other. It must include countries where minerals are actually extracted, components are manufactured, data centers are built, food is grown, and key transport corridors pass through. Otherwise, trusted supply chains will quickly start to look like a new form of economic hierarchy, rather than shared security. The United States has ushered in an era of economic warfare, having learned to use points of leverage as weapons: the dollar, export controls, technology licenses, access to the American market, and financial infrastructure. Now other countries have learned to do the same. The advantages of the United States have diminished not only because others have created competing forms of leverage, but also because Washington has too often used its own advantages carelessly. Every sanction, tariff, or ban may be justified at the time, but their accumulation creates an effect where countries begin to insure themselves against the very possibility of American coercion. To thrive in this era of rupture, and to shape the order that will emerge after it, Washington must wage economic warfare in a more coordinated and strategic way. The old globalization is gone. The alternative is a transition from chaotic economic warfare to a disciplined, allied, and strategically limited model, not seeking complete autarky, but building sufficiently reliable alternative supply chains, coordinating sanctions and industrial policy with partners, and creating a new Pax Economica, a bloc-based but managed economic order. We carefully read all your comments. Share your thoughts with us. Do you think that economic Cold War has already become the new normal? And what solution do you think is necessary for the world to get out of this abyss of sanctions, dependencies, and economic blackmail? Friends, we have an ambitious goal: to reach 200,000 subscribers on the channel by the end of 2026. You might be watching us for a long time and not even realize that you haven't subscribed. Subscribe to our channel and tell your relatives and friends about it. Also, give us a like and leave a comment under this video. We thank all our donors, patrons, and sponsors on YouTube. Every contribution you make brings Ukraine closer to economic prosperity and well-being. After all, we are not just making videos, we are educating voters who will choose real reformers. Help us with this. The link to support the price of the state is in the description. This video was created thanks to the support of Atlas Network. The opinions of the authors do not necessarily reflect those of Atlas Network.